So let's go ahead, because I may not remember to change this on Canvas. Just know that this is due Thursday, 9/12. And for this portion of it, can I have your attention, please? For this portion, you do have to do this on graph paper. So homework 9, I'm changing the due date to Thursday. The test has been moved to Monday. And we're graphing the rest of this week. That's all we're gonna do is graphing. If you don't have graph paper, I'm gonna share it until I run out. And once I run out, it's over, okay? This homework assignment, only the second part, you need graph paper. Well, actually, you need graph paper for both, so. All right, any questions? Can we get started? Okay, so we have A, H, and K. This is just a synopsis of what they are, a review from Algebra 2. A is the number in front of the function. That's going to either stretch, compress, or reflect it. The H value is always inside. And remember, because it's inside, it's always the opposite. H is opposite. H is going to move the graph left or right. So horizontal means it moves it left and right. And then lastly, you have your K value. That's a vertical shift, which means it's going to move it up and down. So we're going to graph a lot of different things. We're going to graph quadratics, square roots, absolute values, and I believe cubic functions, okay? That's why this has an F right here, because that F means that it doesn't matter what kind of function it is. The parentheses, if it's a quadratic or a cubic or absolute value, is always inside of the parentheses or absolute value bar. Did you need something?
I need scissors.
I'll get it for you later. We'll skip it and we'll find it later. It's in my desk. I have to dig it out. Okay, so it's in parentheses. If it's a square root, it's underneath. Okay. So that's your introduction, and we're just going to start graphing. That's it. So this should be a review. But we're just going to work through it. So let's start off with our first one. Let's go ahead on your graph paper. Go ahead, copy this down. And we're going to graph it out. When you graph, you need to have a minimum of 5 points, 4 to 5 ordered pairs, depending on the function. So we're going to start off by graphing this. This is y equals 2, parentheses, x plus 1 squared minus 4. So we call this a quadratic function. This is a quadratic. Does anyone know what this looks like? What shape does it look like? What letter? A U. This is what it looks like. Okay. And this point here, that's called your vertex. So to find your vertex, you need H and K. Remember, this is H. This is K, and this is A. So I'm going to graph this by making a table. That's a good question. Does anybody know? How did I know it's a quadratic? Squared. Anytime you square something, it's a quadratic. Good question. All right, so I'm going to make my table. And I don't know if this is the best way to do it. I've done this a lot of different ways, but I think this might be the easiest way. In the middle of our table, unless it's a square root, we're always going to put our vertex. So remember that H and K is our vertex. Does anybody know what H and K will be in this function? Not close. Not 1, -4.
-4.
-1, -4. So let's go back here. Remember, H is the only one that you have to flip it. Only for H. Is everybody listening? For H, you have to flip it. So if it's positive, it becomes negative. And if it's negative, it becomes positive. Because what we really have in this parentheses is x minus -1 squared. Except we know that when it's two negatives, it changes to a positive, okay? So in the middle of your table, you're going to put your vertex, which is -1, -4. That's the middle point. I'm going to go ahead and graph that, -1, -4. And then I think the easiest way to do that would be to look at the number line. So I have -1. And we're just going to let our calculator do the rest. So my vertex is here. Remember, you need 5 points, so let's keep it simple. Everybody look at me. Pick the two numbers on the left and the two numbers on the right. We're just going to use these 5 numbers right here. So we're going to go from -3 to 1. So let's fill in our table. Doesn't matter if you go from the bottom up or from the top down. I'm going to go 1, 0, -2, -3. When you do this, if you use these points, if you follow the process I'm telling you, whatever you get here, you should get here. And whatever you get here, you should get here. And if you don't, that means you typed it in wrong. So let's go ahead and pick up our calculators. Well, first I'm going to write it out. So remember, it's 2x plus 1 squared minus 4. So I have 2. This is how I usually do. I just write it out. Again, you don't have to write this out. If you I'm just telling you how I would do it, but you do you. You do you. So, and I'm just going to put in these numbers. I'm going to put a 1 in, a 0 in, a -2 in, and a -3 in. Oops, I forgot to put the square. Got to have that square or it's not going to work. But that's how you type that in your calculator. So go ahead and do that to get your other 4 values and graph it. And that's it. So we're going to start with the vertex. Pick 2 numbers to the left, 2 numbers to the right, and graph it. Okay, so I like to do it without a calculator. I think it's easier. 1 plus 1 is 2. 2 squared is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 minus 4 is 4. Who got 4 for the first one? All right. 1 squared is 1. 1 minus 4 is -3. -1 squared. Wait, that is not right. Hold on. 1 squared is 1. 1 times 2 is 2. And 2 minus 4 is -2. So I'm going to just fill in the rest. And you all make sure that these are the right numbers. That's what I got without a calculator. So verify it. If you agree, go ahead and graph it. It should make a smile. So I'm going to put a point at 1, 4. 0, -2, -2, -2, And this is this. Okay. And I can't remember if they asked you to do this, but let's just go ahead and write our domain and range, because you should know how to find the domain and range from looking at a graph. So looking at this graph does stretch from left to right. Notice you have an arrow pointing left and an arrow pointing right, so your domain is all real numbers. But this one does not have arrows pointing down. So what is our lowest y value? How low does my y value go? -4. So it would be -4 to infinity. And that's that. Any questions?
For domain and range, do you put brackets?
Or
Domain and range.
so we do for range because it's -4 is actually on our graph. It's a closed point on our graph. So we do put a bracket. Infinity never gets a bracket. All right, any questions? Ready for the next one? We just gonna graph for about, we gonna do as many graphs as we can fit in and pick up here tomorrow. All right, so now we got this one. What kind of function is that? Is this a quadratic? Does anyone know what we call it when it has a power of 3? It's called a cubic, yeah. And if you don't know, a cubic looks something like this. And that middle point is our vertex. So I'm gonna go ahead and make my table. This one, because we have arrows going opposite directions, we don't have a lowest point. So let's start off by, again, I always put my vertex in the middle. I just think that's the easiest way. What is the vertex or the middle point for this function? What did you say? Is it 1, -2 or -1, -2? Is all, +1, -2, because you always flip the sign if it's inside. So +1, -2. So again, looking at your number line, to keep it simple, everybody look at me. You see how we're at a 1? We're not gonna go all the way down here and all the way there. We're gonna keep it simple. We're just gonna pick the numbers that's hugging the 1. So we're gonna go from -1 to 3. That's it. Keep it simple. So I'm trying to tell you the easiest way to go about graphing. Now, none of our y values are going to repeat this time. So go ahead and type it in your calculator. If you don't want to do 1/2, you could use a decimal, whichever way you prefer. Again, none of these numbers are going to match. So I'll give you about 2 minutes to type those in. Anyone need help typing in a cube root? Or not a cube root, but a power of 3. Okay. I just took out my post. Well, it's okay. I have a million of them. I don't know why I did that. That was crazy. I just popped it out the back of my head. Okay. We're going to get some decimals this time for the 2 and the 0. We get decimals. You need a calculator. Ma'am, here you go. I'm gonna help you do well. Anybody else need a calculator? Okay. We don't just sit here, we gotta participate. Oh wait, I did that backwards. All right, compare your answers with mine. Is that what you all got for your, raise your hand if you got those numbers for your Y values. All right, let's go ahead and graph it. And for the halfway, we're just gonna approximate it the best we can. So I'm gonna put my point, my first point is at -1, -6. And then I have one at 0, -2, oh, -2.5. So that's gonna be halfway between -2 and -3. And then at the 1, I'm at -2. And then I go up halfway between -1 and -2. And then 3, I'm here. So it kind of just looks like this. And it kind of makes it bends and it comes down. So this graph goes left and right, and it also goes up and down. Whenever you don't have an absolute max or min, that means your domain and range will be all real numbers. So our arrows point, one points down and one points up, and then we also have an arrow going left and an arrow going right. All right, so our next function we're going to talk about is absolute value. Let's go ahead and copy this down. Now, this is the one that's tricky because you can't use a calculator. You're going to have to do some thinking because we don't have an absolute value bar on our calculator, okay? So you can't just type this in. But these are called absolute values. Have you all seen these before, these straight bars? All right, what do we know about absolute value? Absolute value is always what? Always positive. What'd you say, Jaden? Oh, it's the distance from 0. And when we talk about distance, like if I said, how far am I from the board? You wouldn't say, oh, you're about -25 feet. Whenever we talk about distance, distance is positive. And that's why for absolute value, we just have to remember that it's always positive. It looks similar to a quadratic because we do have repeating values, except now, instead of it looking like the letter U, it's pointed. It looks like a letter V. And this bottom point is our vertex. So again, this is the only one that you cannot use a calculator for. You're going to have to do some math, like you're going to have to think. So again, I'm going to make my little 5 lines, my X, my Y, Vertex in the middle. And where is the vertex? Is it at -3, -5, or +3, -5? +3, -5. And then I'm just going to count back and forward. Now this one, I don't really know. I'm going to write this one kind of small because we got 2 times the absolute value of so messy, y'all. Okay, I'm going to talk you through this one. These first 2 together. Now, the good thing about absolute value, again, is that whatever we put here, it should be the same thing here. And whatever we get here, it should be the same thing here. So since we can't use a calculator, we're going to talk about this together. Okay, first thing you want to do is 1 minus 3. What is 1 minus 3? -2. So we have 2 times the absolute value of -2 minus 5. And now we have to figure out what's the absolute value of -2. 2. So now that we took the absolute value, we can change it to a parentheses. It'll be 2 times 2 minus 5. Now you could technically use your calculator, but we shouldn't need a calculator for 4 minus 5. And 4 minus 5 is -1. Then we do the same thing for this next one. 2 minus 3 is -1, so we have 2 times the absolute value of -1 minus 5. The absolute value of -1 is +1. So 2 minus 5 is -3. Now, I will tell you this and I don't know if this is going to help you. I don't want to confuse people. But there is a little bit of a trick with the absolute value. And that's that the distance between these numbers is going to be A. And do you see how A is 2? And if you look at the number line, the distance from -5 to -3 is 2. From -3 to -1 is 2. But if that confuses you, don't even worry about it. Just go the long way. Do the long way. So if you finish this out, you should get -3 and -1 again. Let's go ahead and graph it. And it should look like 2 straight lines coming together. So your domain, because we have arrows pointing left and right, our domain is all real numbers. But our range, what is our lowest Y value? When we look at the Y value of our vertex, what do we get? -5. So bracket -5 to infinity. All right, and the last one we're going to do together. Tomorrow we're going to focus on piecewise. No, we'll do 2 more today. And then we'll finish it. If you need more graph paper, I got more here. Got more. Okay, now we're going to talk about a square root. And then we'll end, well, we got 1 more and then 1 more parabola. So this is a square root. This is the first one that has a domain restriction. So the first thing I want you to do is figure out your domain. Now remember, this is going back to the quiz we took. We only focus on this part. So your domain is x plus 4 has to be greater than or equal to 0. Go ahead and solve that. So we're going to find our domain first. What's going to be our domain for this one? X has to be what? Yeah, x has to be greater than or equal to -4. So what that tells us is when we do our table, the vertex has to be -4, and we can only pick numbers. Everybody look here. Look at me. I can't use any of these numbers, right? I can only pick numbers here forward. Okay, so hopefully this does not confuse people, but I'm going to tell you the way I think of this. Now, when you do it on the test, you can pick any number, but it has to be greater than -4. I don't want to have decimals, so these are the numbers I use. And I'm going to see if you can figure out why I picked those numbers. That's just what I did, because I don't want to have to deal with a decimal. So I want to be clear. Do you have to pick the numbers that I picked?
No.
Nope. I just picked the numbers that I knew would give me a whole number. Because what I want is perfect squares underneath the square root. So I know that if I add these together, I get 0, which is a perfect square. And I add these together, I get 1, which is a perfect square. If I use -2 or -1, I'm going to get a decimal. I don't want to fool with a decimal, so I didn't use that. I used 0 next because 0 plus 4 is a perfect square. And then 5 plus 4 is a perfect square. So go ahead and get your numbers here. Oops. Now we already should know that our first one is going to be -3 because that's our vertex. So this is our first point. Because in this one, we actually start with the vertex. And if you don't know, I like to think of a square root as an eyebrow. It just goes one direction. You know, in geometry where it's called a ray, you have a start and no end. That's what a square root looks like. All right, so let's go ahead and get your other 3 numbers. And we'll graph it out. Then tomorrow we'll do 2 more, and then we'll get into our piecewise. So I know, like for this one, I'm going to have the square root of 1. I think sometimes using your calculator slows you up, but this is the square root of 1. The square root of 1 is 1. 1 times 2 is 2, and 2 minus 3 is -1. And this should be a +1, and this should be a +3. Go ahead and check it to make sure, though. I kind of see why they don't let people use calculators in college, because it's kind of a time waster. Because you all know what 2 times 2 is, and then subtract 3, but we use our calculator, and that slows us up. Like, we don't need a calculator for this. All right, so let's go ahead and graph it. So -4, -3, that's my start. So right here is my start. And then it goes -3, down 1. At 0, up 1. And at 5, up 3. And I don't know, it looks like it just goes one direction like that. Don't put 2 arrows on this graph, because this graph has a domain restriction. If you put an arrow on both sides, that means the domain is all real numbers, and it's not all real numbers. So for this graph, your domain, we already wrote it, I'll just write it again, would be bracket -4 to infinity. And our range would be what? -3 to infinity. All right, we're going to do one more graph today, and then we'll be finished. Any questions so far? So again, only thing we're adding to the chapter 2 test is you have to graph. I'm not going to tell you what you have to graph. It could be a square root. It could be a parabola. It could be a cubic. It could be an absolute value. It could be any of the ones that we're covering. All right, last one we're going to do is one more quadratic, except this one is going to be a frown. So because it's a square, I know this is a quadratic. And because A is negative, this one is going to be a frown. So this one has an absolute max instead of an absolute min. So we're going to make our table.
Brian? So on the last one, why did we only do 4 points?
We could have did more, but the next one we would need, so we get up to 9, so 16. So I would have had to go all the way up to x to get a 16 underneath here. I would have needed to go to x equals 12, and my graph only went to 10. And that's why I said when you take your test, you need to have a minimum of 4 points. So 4 is enough. Yeah. All right, so we got our vertex. It's at -1, +6. And again, we're just going to pick the numbers going up and going down. Now, because this one is a quadratic, we do have some repeating values. So I'm going to give you a moment. I'm not going to write it out. Go ahead and find those 4 values. You're just going to type it in your equation. We got 1 + 1 is 2. 2 squared is 4. -12. -6. Okay, yeah. And this is our last one. So go ahead and find your other 4 points.
do like 2 of them and the other one should be good.
Yeah, they should match. So the ones I have highlighted in green should be the same. And the ones highlighted in pink should be the same. So what did you get for your first and last point? What did you get for these two?
I guess -6.
Anybody else get -6 for these two?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I got, I think, we okay.
What you get? 3?
Yes.
Anybody else get 3? All right, that's what I got too. So let's go ahead and graph it out. So 1 down 6, 0, 3, and then -1, +6, and then we come back down. Because the A value is negative, this is just, it's really skinny. It's vertically stretched. And then the last thing, our domain is all real numbers. And can someone raise your hand? Don't say it out loud, but who could tell me the range? I'm just curious. Who could tell me the range? All right, anybody want me to ask them the range? Jasmine, you the only one. Everybody else put their hand down. They got scared. For the range.
It would be bracket +6 to
Close. You got to switch it. So you got to start with the smallest number. Negative infinity comes first because that's the smallest number in the world. And it goes all the way up to +6. 6 gets a bracket. All right, good work, y'all. We're going to end here. And tomorrow, if you want to grab some graph paper so you have it for tomorrow, feel free to come up and grab some. I have plenty. And then we will pick up here tomorrow.